Today I want to talk about something that I feel was overlooked when I translated excerpts from the press conference with a Riot representative and a Tencent representative. You may remember the press conference where they announced that there will be a tournament in July of some sort of unnamed format, things like this. Everyone in the community was really excited and completely ignored the rest of the information presented. The rest of the information to me is actually much huger than a possibility of a July tournament. In fact, I thought that that was the least important aspect of it, and my editor was like, I think this is the biggest news, it should be moved up in the thing, when he was talking about the international event, and it's, really? Really, are we not? But the thing that I'm talking about is the possibility of a traveling circuit where League of Legends will be played across multiple cities. Now, the reason why I think this was easily overlooked by Western consumers is because they're talking about it for Chinese tournaments. The Chinese teams will travel to Chinese cities across China during the Chinese season. Do I sound like Donald Trump? All of this seems really unimportant, except if you think about it for 5 minutes, you realize that historically, if Riot has applied something in one region, they want it to be really universal. This includes applying age limits when it makes no sense, because Chinese teams still have underage players just hanging out in the house and playing all the time, but they can't play on stage, so effectively they're not really recognized as players, and I'm not sure what Riot was trying to protect them from. The point is that Riot like to universalize things. Everything has BO3 now. Certain leagues got larger with regards to how many teams are participating in them. Every league follows a similar schedule. They got rid of the Champions League. A bunch of other things that happened eventually allowed for Riot to create like some sort of uniform system across leagues where they're providing or trying to provide similar infrastructure, they're trying to provide similar viewing experience, make everything feel like the competition is almost the same regardless of region. So if there's something really big like a traveling tournament circuit, chances are they're going to try to apply it in other places as well, because this is a huge discrepancy. If LPL teams would start moving from one city to another from week to week, then this would be a huge difference compared LPL to the LCS regions or the LCK, things like this. So I actually think that it's worthy of a lot more discussion in terms of how this would be applied not just in China, but in the West and the rest of the world. And there's even more reason to suspect that this is something Riot would look into, because it's very similar to what was announced in the Overwatch League. And it's something that people have kind of been talking about off and on, which is, why don't we make it more like traditional sports, where each city gets a pro team? Woo! So first of all, let's talk about exactly what was said in the press conference, just so we make sure we're not getting ahead of ourselves. Jin Yibo and Ye Qiang were talking about how they really want to make the social aspect of gaming more friendly. So they want it to seem less like a bunch of people are sitting in their basements and watching these games. There's more interaction between fans. So a way to do that is to bring pro teams to more cities in China, right? So the stigma of China is kind of lessened a bit. And they really like what's happening in the West with the NBA teams investing into teams and buying teams in the LCS. They like this idea a lot. So they're basically on board with making it feel more mainstream and more like a real sport in this sense. So they want to create an opportunity for teams to move from city to city. They say that obviously right now with the current format it's a bit difficult, and for this season, of course, LPL will remain in Shanghai, but they want to look forward to set up a plan to make it so that maybe we have more of a traveling circuit going on. And right now they have a model in Jiangsu. So they have something similar to the European national leagues, where you have a league in different provinces of China, and then they compete later to get promoted to the LSPL. They've tried kind of an experiment in Jiangsu where they have the teams move around in Jiangsu to create kind of a circuit event like this. So they're testing this and they're actively thinking about it. So all of this to me points to signs that in the end, in the near future, LPL would want to create more of a city-type circuit format where everyone's moving around. They also like the idea of local infrastructure interacting with teams, so they like the idea of a city housing or being home to a team, like is in some professional sports. Of course, again, we're bringing this back to the West, so I'm not going to talk about the peculiarities of why I think this would be challenging in particular in China. But instead, I'm going to talk about even more unique challenges that are in the West, because when you talk about the geographic expanse of Europe or North America, you're talking about a much larger place to cover, and these are different challenges from creating this type of format in Korea or in parts of China. China is still a fairly large geographical country, or the LMS area. First of all, let's talk about why, or some of these other incentives as to why we would create some sort of circuit like this and give each city its own team, kind of the way professional sports does it. Well, first of all, it, as they mentioned in the Overwatch League, can create a sense of stability, right? Where each team is locked into a specific location, everyone has their own stable sense of income. Maybe they get investments from the city itself that helps create a venue for the traveling circuit, things like this. So I think that this sense of having a team that belongs to you prevents everyone from just bandwagoning the most popular team every year. Bandwagoning Team Solo Mid, bandwagoning Fnatic, things of that nature. Also, Riot wants to create a sense of long-term stability in the game that makes League of Legends not just a flash-in-the-pan type game that moves on for another esport to take over. And they might think that this is something that creates that sense for you. Also, Riot have been super hesitant to rope teams into revenue sharing. And with things like the BAMTech deal coming out in the coming year, it's not surprising that they might think of other sustainable models and start grouping in revenue sharing then. If they're not happy with the model now, with just all these teams in LA or all these teams in Berlin, of course they're probably not going to do the revenue sharing thing, because the idea of suddenly moving teams to cities would be a big cost sink or a big new environment that they need to kind of get buy-in for, right? Or that they might be happier if they get sports teams to do this sort of thing, where sports teams already have an established fan base in that area. So all of this sort of thing would make some sense for Riot to be dragging their heels on this if they have a plan like this for the future. Again, not saying that they do, but science points to this at least being something that they're thinking about in certain locations, so why not globally? Now that I've kind of talked about the sort of social aspect, or why this might be an incentive, or why it might make sense with Riot's long-term plan, let's also talk about some things that I'm really concerned about that could be really, really big that maybe people haven't necessarily brought up. And this one is a more common concern that I think will be brought up, is the idea of the grueling travel schedule, the grueling practice schedule, the fact that everyone is moving all the time. In the past, there were a lot of issues with teams that were flying from separate locations. For example, Team Solo Mid used to be located in New York. When the LCS became based in LA, they decided to move in LA because moving back and forth from LA and New York every week was pretty taxing, and there was a big announcement that, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to have our new gaming house, I think in 2013 when they decided to make that decision. But gaming, very famously, their practice declined, and people like Thorin have suggested that part of the reason is that they had to fly in from Russia every week to go and compete in the LCS because they didn't have residence status in Germany, and some of them had families and things like this. So that traveling takes a toll on your consistent level of play and your ability to get as much practice as you would otherwise. So the question then becomes, does this mean we're going to have fewer games? Are we going to have as many games every week? Since there is a constant demand and appetite for us having a certain minimum amount of games, we can't just have two teams face each other once in a season. That's not sustainable, that's not good. We can't just have two teams face each other for one best of one in a regular season. That's not sustainable, that's not good. So what impact does it have on the number of games if we're then also implementing a travel regimen where you have to travel every week? It's just not something that we can necessarily fit in. So we have to ask the question, how does the format change? Do we have fewer games? Okay? Or is it just that suddenly everyone is really tired, burnt out, the quality of the competition declines to an extent, or maybe they just practice less and then the quality of the competition might decline to that extent also, which might not have the same impact on some of the smaller regions like LMS or Korea, where maybe they aren't traveling for as long of a distance every week as teams do. Also, when you talk about having disparate locations like this, I mentioned earlier being in New York. If you're in New York, you might occasionally be able to scrim a European team or two, right? So if you have East Coast teams, your practice environment might be very different depending on the ping. You also have ping concerns. There was a big outcry about moving the server to Chicago in terms of the quality of practice that pro players could get initially. So now you're not only saying we're moving the server away from pro players so that they have a big difference between their practice time on land, but you're going to vary the ping experience for each team depending on location in the entire North America, in Canada, in the US, or what have you, wherever they decide to put teams. So are we going to have a situation where actually we're collectively moving the teams so that they're more centralized, okay? So they're closer to the server, you have maybe an equidistant circle, and then you have some teams that are in, I don't know, northwestern Canada, and some teams that are in like middle southeast US or something like this. I don't know how you would deal with it in North America in particular. Then also, I think a lot of the solution to some of these is using TR or using a LAN client, which also becomes not an option if teams are in different locations, right? Because you can't use a local area connection to simulate zero ping if you're not in the same location, because you have to cover a much broader distance. So this is also going to change the practice environment. When we talk about how sports teams do this, right, a lot of them have really large rosters, and they just practice against each other. The 53-man rosters for an NFL team with 11 players that can be on the field at a time, and then they have an additional practice squad of like 8 to 10 players or something like this that they can throw into the mix, and they can practice against each other like this. So will it become where, in addition to the demand of flying to a different location every week, are you going to add an additional cost of always having an active practice roster? What does it mean to always have an active practice roster? Are we going to be able to field enough talent for each team to have a high-level team and a practice roster? And the practice roster has to basically agree to not play. So does everyone also have a 10-man roster, right? Where you are effectively training two separate teams at once, and week to week you will run different rosters. Do we have some sort of high level like that going on when we talk about how we're going to set up practice going forward? Because if you then have the best team with the best resources, they're going to take the 10 best players, right? And then going down from there and there and there. And do we have the talent pool to fill this sort of resource requirement? So these are all additional concerns that would have to be brought up when you're bringing this up, just like the strain of travel, how will practice and the quality of games change, and is it necessarily worth having a local scene and more of a social interaction and feeling more like a sport? Obviously, these are all concerns within the Overwatch community as well, but Overwatch has less of an established system already, so there's not necessarily something to compare it to. If you tell the Overwatch League that this is going to be how it is, they don't have necessarily an adjustment period or anything like that, since the league didn't exist yet, whereas I feel like there will be a much larger adjustment shock for the League of Legends community, and I'm not really sure how I would personally take it. I prefer and prioritize a higher level of competition, and for me, I see this as a way that level of competition declines and it becomes more merchandised. So I'm not initially super on board with the idea of this being effective. I also see this as being increased cost for the time being, and you're kind of relying on a local scene being established brand and being able to provide money and resources in some sense to help build up a league team or offset some of these costs. I think will initially have to be borne by Riot. So and the new revenue sharing deal maybe. So will the new costs really be offset by more stability within the league, and having these types of localized settings, will teams be more willing to invest more money? Will it encourage more individual sports teams to buy pro esports teams and pro League of Legends teams? These are the questions that I think will be coming up as people consider this model more of a reality or more of a possibility, and this League of Legends press conference that was held in China is just kind of the first hint that it might be a possibility. Again, I'm not saying that this is something Riot are definitely absolutely considering, but these are all questions that I want people to ask to see if this is the kind of model they'd like to have in the future.